Sometimes the only way to survive being erased is to make yourself impossible to ignore. The night Loretta Haynes signed her name on a napkin and handed her stepdaughter across a dinner table, like a line item in a budget, it was raining in Toronto. Not the dramatic kind of rain that would suit the moment in a movie. Just the grey, indifferent drizzle that clings to your coat all the way home and soaks through your shoes before you realize it's happening. Mara didn't cry. She'd run out of that particular resource sometime around her 17th birthday, when she'd understood, really understood, not just suspected, that Loretta didn't see a daughter when she looked at her. She saw a liability, a column in red ink that refused to balance. Mara had spent 4 years keeping the books for Loretta's catering business. 4 years catching the errors, smoothing the cash flow, quietly correcting the invoices. Loretta's actual daughter, Paige, entered wrong because Paige couldn't be bothered to learn the difference between net and gross. Mara did it because it kept a roof over her head, because her father had died owing Loretta 3 years of back rent on a shared property, and the debt had transferred somehow to Mara, at least in Loretta's accounting. The man sitting across the dinner table that night was named Decker. Just Decker. That was how the introduction went. Loretta had said it with a little flutter of her hands, like she was presenting a prize at a gala. "This is Mr. Decker. He's expressed an interest in acquiring a bookkeeper. Privately, long-term." Mara had looked at him. He'd looked at her. He was maybe 40-45. Dark suit, no tie, a scar running from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw that he didn't bother to conceal. The kind of man who had stopped explaining himself to people a long time ago. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, and he didn't fidget, didn't glance at his phone, didn't do any of the small nervous things that people do when they're waiting. He just looked at Mara with eyes that were doing some kind of silent calculation she couldn't read. She looked back at Loretta. "What exactly are you selling?" Mara asked. Loretta's smile went tight. "Don't be dramatic." "I'm not being dramatic. I'm asking for the terms. The terms are that Mr. Decker is offering an arrangement that will clear your father's debt entirely. You'll be compensated. You'll have housing. It's more than you've earned." Mara turned back to Decker. "Is she speaking for you?" Something shifted in his face. It wasn't quite amusement. It was more like someone had put a very small weight on one side of a scale, and it had barely moved. "No," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "She's not. Then what are your terms?" He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the rain tapped against the window. "My organization needs someone who can read numbers the way other people read faces," he said. "Someone who won't steal, won't talk, won't panic. And you think I'm that person? I think you've been correcting someone else's ledgers for 4 years and haven't taken a dollar you weren't owed." "Yes." Mara sat with that. She thought about the apartment she'd go back to tonight, the one she shared with 2 other women from the catering crew, where her room was a converted closet with a curtain for a door. She thought about the envelope in her bag with $312 in it, which was what remained of her last pay after Loretta's deductions for housing assistance and administrative fees that Mara had never been able to successfully dispute. She thought about the fact that no one at this table was going to ask for her consent. Loretta had already decided. The only question was what Mara was going to do with whatever small amount of agency she had left. "I want the debt documentation," she said. "In writing, signed, tonight." Loretta made a sound. Decker said, "Done, and I want to see whatever I'll be managing before I agree to manage it. That's reasonable. And if I find anything that suggests this is a situation I can't survive, I walk." There was a pause, the rain. Loretta's held breath. "You won't find that," Decker said. He said it the way you say something you know to be true, the way you know the weight of your own hand. Not a threat, not a reassurance, just a fact he had no particular reason to dress up. Mara picked up the pen Loretta had optimistically placed next to the napkin. She thought, "I know what I'm doing. I know exactly what this is." She signed. The building Decker's driver took her to was in the West End. Not the shiny part of the West End where the condos were going up on every empty lot, but the older part where the warehouses had been converted into something that looked like a logistics company on the outside and was clearly not a logistics company on the inside. Mara clocked it in the first 20 minutes. The vehicles in the lot were too expensive and too varied. The men moving through the loading bay at 11 at night were too calm for actual freight work, and the office she was shown to had a financial system on its computer that was generating about 4 times the paper trail it should have been for the declared revenue. She sat in front of the screen for a long time. Then she opened a new spreadsheet and started working. She didn't see Decker again for 2 days. When he came to the office, he stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. She got the impression he'd been watching her work for a few seconds before she noticed him. Not in a threatening way, but in the way of someone checking that a piece of machinery is running correctly. "Well," he said. Mara turned her chair around. She'd printed out 3 pages of notes. She handed them to him. "Your wash cycle has a 17% inefficiency on the transit accounts," she said. "Someone has been skimming from the Vancouver disbursements. Not a lot, but consistently, which means it's deliberate. And your declared losses in Q3 are overclaimed by about 40,000, which doesn't save you as much tax as whoever calculated it thought it would, and actually creates a flag pattern that could attract attention." He read through her notes. He didn't react visibly to any of it. When he was done, he looked up. "How long have you known about the Vancouver issue?" "Since yesterday morning. Why didn't you report it immediately?" "Because I wanted to be sure. I don't report things I'm not sure of." He studied her for a moment. "Most people in your position would have been too frightened to put any of this in writing. I'm not most people in my position," Mara said. "Also, being frightened doesn't help anything. It just makes you slower." Decker set the papers on the desk. He pulled the other chair out. She hadn't even registered that there was another chair in the room until that moment, and sat down across from her. "What do you need to do this job properly?" he said. She had a list ready. She'd made it the first night. She handed it to him. He read it, turned the page over as though looking for more. "This is it? That's it. You didn't ask for anything personal. Most people ask for something personal." "I figured I'd see how the first month went," Mara said. Something happened in his face again. That barely their shift. "All right," he said. He stood up. "You'll have access to the full system by end of day. If you find anything else, come to me directly. Not to anyone else in the building directly, to me. What if you're not available?" "I'm always available to you," he said. "That's the one thing you don't need to put on a list." He left. Mara turned back to her screen. She told herself it didn't mean anything. It was a practical arrangement. He needed someone capable. She needed somewhere to be. That was all. She believed that for about 3 weeks. The house was north of the city, set back from the road behind a tree line that made it invisible until you were already in the driveway. Mara moved there in October, when Decker's second-in-command, a woman named Sable, who had the energy of someone who had seen every kind of human foolishness and found it only mildly interesting, told her that the commute from her apartment was a security risk and that she'd be more useful on site. Mara's apartment had been a converted closet with a curtain for a door. The room she was given at the house had a window seat and a private bathroom and bookshelves that someone had stocked with what turned out to be a genuinely good selection of financial theory, and one very battered copy of Anne of Green Gables that she was almost certain had been placed there by accident. She kept the Anne book. She wasn't sure why she worked. That was mostly what she did. Decker's organization was larger than she'd initially mapped. Operations in 4 cities, a network of front companies that required constant maintenance, a payroll that had to be managed in ways that didn't appear on any official document. It was, in a technical sense, the most interesting accounting problem she'd ever encountered. She understood why he needed someone good at it. She understood why he'd needed to acquire that person through channels that didn't involve LinkedIn. What she hadn't understood going in was Decker himself. He was not what she'd expected. She'd expected brutal. She'd expected the kind of man who ran things by force of fear, who kept people in line through threat and occasional example. She'd seen enough of that type in the catering world. Smaller scale, obviously, but the same essential mechanism. The man who made sure everyone knew the cost of disappointing him. Decker wasn't that. He was precise. That was the word that kept coming to her. He ran his organization the way a very good accountant runs a set of books, everything in its correct place, every debt recorded, every obligation tracked. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats he didn't intend to keep. When someone in his network failed, he assessed the failure with the same dispassionate attention he brought to everything else, determined whether it was a problem of capacity or character, and responded accordingly. He was also, she noticed over time, paying attention to her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable. In a way that was almost clinical, the same way he paid attention to everything that operated within his sphere. He noticed when she was working past midnight and started having coffee sent to the office without being asked. He noticed when she mentioned, once offhandedly, that she'd never learned to drive, and arranged for someone to take her to the test center in November. He noticed when she came to a meeting and the chair was the wrong height for the desk and had it replaced before the next one. She didn't know what to do with any of that. She'd spent 24 years being noticed only when she was in the way. The moment things shifted, if she had to point to a moment, was a Thursday in late November. She'd found something. Not skimming this time. Something worse. One of Decker's lieutenants, a man called Ferris, had been running a secondary set of books entirely, redirecting a percentage of every major transaction into an account that Mara could trace, with some patience, to a rival organization operating out of Hamilton. He wasn't just stealing. He was feeding information. Had been for at least 8 months. She stood outside Decker's office for longer than she would like to admit. She knew what finding this meant. She knew what Decker would do with the information. She'd been careful this whole time not to know too many specific things about what happened to problems when Decker resolved them. She knocked. He opened the door himself. Looked at her. Looked at the folder in her hands. "How bad?" he said. "Bad." He stood back to let her in. She laid it out for him, methodically, the same way she'd laid out the Vancouver issue, every document, every traced account, every date. When she was done, she stacked the papers neatly, the way she always did, and sat with her hands in her lap and waited. Decker sat across from her. He was quiet for a long time. "You could have given this to Sable," he said. "You told me to come to you directly." Most people would have found a way to rationalize going around that instruction. "Given what the information is," Mara looked at him. "I don't rationalize things," she said. "I made an agreement. I kept it." Another silence. Outside the window, the first snow of the year was coming down through the dark, very soft, catching the light from the house. "Why did you take so long to knock?" he said. She blinked. She hadn't thought he'd noticed. She'd been standing there for maybe 5 minutes, maybe more. But of course he'd noticed. He noticed everything. "Because I knew what you'd do with this," she said. "And I needed a minute to decide if I was all right with being the person who handed it to you. And I decided that Ferris made his own choices. I'm just the one who can read the receipts." Something in Decker's face changed. Not the small shift she was used to, something larger, more like a door opening slightly, then going still. "You're not frightened of me," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite an accusation. "I didn't say that. You're afraid of other things." She met his eyes. "Aren't you?" The snow kept falling outside. He looked at her for a long time, in a way that made her feel less like an operational asset and more like a person, which was a feeling she hadn't been offered often enough to be comfortable with it. "Stay here tonight," he said. Not a command. Not even really a request. More like something that had been decided somewhere further back in the conversation and was only now finding words. "The roads will be bad." She knew the roads would be fine. She also knew that wasn't what he was saying. "All right," she said. She found out about the debt from Loretta 3 weeks before Christmas. In a phone call she had not initiated and did not want. Loretta called the main house line. Mara still didn't know how she'd gotten the number and said, in the voice she used when she wanted to sound like a reasonable person, that she had some concerns, that she'd heard things, that the situation with Mr. Decca was perhaps more complicated than she'd understood when she'd made the arrangement, and that if Mara was uncomfortable, Loretta was prepared to discuss renegotiating the terms, perhaps for a finder's fee. "You don't get a finder's fee," Mara said. "Excuse me, you're not an agent, you're not a broker. You're someone who tried to trade me for debt forgiveness and it worked, so I'm going to need you to stop calling this number and stop pretending you had my interests in mind at any point in this story." A silence. Then Loretta, her voice losing its reasonable coating. "You were always ungrateful. Your father was the same way." Mara thought about her father. He had been a gentle man who kept bad company and couldn't say no to anyone who needed something. He had not been good with money. He had loved Mara in the uncomplicated way of people who aren't trying to leverage their love for anything. "Don't talk about my father," Mara said. "I'm just saying, don't call this number again." She hung up. She sat for a moment in the small room off the kitchen where the secondary line was. Then she went and found Decca, who was in the library with a cup of coffee and a report she'd filed 2 days ago, and she told him about the call. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When she was done, he said, "Do you want me to handle it?" "No," Mara said. "I've already handled it." He looked at her. "That's not what I'm asking." She understood then that he was asking something else, whether she wanted him to act on her behalf. Not for operational reasons, not because Loretta was a liability, because she was angry and she'd been wronged and he was offering, in his way, to be someone who gave weight to that. She stood very still. "She doesn't deserve the attention," Mara said finally. "She's not worth your time. What about your time? I already spent mine, on the phone just now." He nodded slowly, as though she'd said something he was going to keep. She turned to go. He said her name, just her name, nothing after it, and she stopped. "The debt is cleared," he said. "Has been since October. I should have told you earlier." She didn't turn around immediately. She looked at the doorframe in front of her for a moment, tracing the grain of the wood. "Why didn't you?" "I wasn't sure how you'd take it." She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to have a thing held over you, and then what it meant to have that thing simply removed without ceremony, without leverage, without being asked for anything in return. "I would have taken it fine," she said. "I know that now." She turned around. He was watching her with that particular attention of his, the kind that didn't flinch and didn't perform. "Then we're square," she said. "We're square," he agreed, but neither of them moved for a while. The trouble, when it came, arrived in January in the form of a man named Galt. Mara had seen the name in the accounts. Galt ran the Hamilton organization that Ferris had been feeding. After Ferris, there'd been a period of relative quiet that Mara recognized, from her reading of the books, as the kind of quiet that happens when one side is reorganizing and the other side is waiting. The waiting ended on a Wednesday. Sable came to find Mara in the office and told her to move to the inner rooms and stay there. Her voice was calm, which Mara had learned meant the situation was serious. Calm was Sable's register for serious. Volume was for things that could still be managed. Mara moved to the inner room. She was not, temperamentally, someone who could sit and wait. She'd brought her laptop. She worked. It was 2 hours before Decca came to find her. She heard his footsteps in the hall. She'd learned his walk, the particular economy of it, and looked up when he opened the door. He had a cut on his hand, wrapped in something that had been white and wasn't anymore. "It's handled," he said. "Galt?" "Not a problem any further." She nodded. She looked at his hand. "You should have that looked at properly." "I will." "You won't. You'll decide it's fine and leave it." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "Probably," he said. She closed her laptop and stood up and went to the first aid kit that she had personally relocated to the inner room 3 weeks ago, because Decca's original placement of it had been in a hall closet near the front entrance, which was, from a tactical standpoint, not useful in a situation that involved retreating to the inner rooms. He watched her do this without comment. She unwrapped his hand. The cut was long but not deep. She cleaned it without flinching, and she pressed gauze to it, and she taped it properly. And she did all of this with the same methodical attention she brought to the accounts. When she was done, she didn't step back immediately. "You scared me," she said. She said it plainly, the way she said all true things. When Sable came to get me, Decker looked down at her. He was very close. He smelled like cold air and something that had been burning. "I told you," he said quietly. "That's not a thing you need to worry about. I told you I don't rationalize things," she said. "That includes pretending not to feel things I feel." He raised his good hand. He set it against the side of her face with a carefulness that seemed at odds with every other thing about him, like someone who'd learned to be careful with certain things late and was still being precise about it. "Mara," he said, just her name. But the way he said it, the whole of it, like it was an account he'd been keeping that finally balanced. "I know," she said. Loretta called one more time. February. She'd heard from somewhere that things had changed, that Mara wasn't just managing books anymore, that she was at the table, that Decker listened to her in a way he didn't listen to most people, and that this had not gone unremarked upon in certain circles. Loretta's voice on the phone had a different quality this time. The reasonable coating was gone entirely. What was underneath it was something Mara recognized. A person who had made calculations that hadn't paid off, trying to find a ledger that still balanced in their favor. "I'm your family," Loretta said. "You're the woman who signed a napkin," Mara said. "That's the transaction we have. There isn't another one. I made a mistake. You made there's a difference. You know there's a difference. You taught me the difference, actually, without meaning to." Loretta started to say something else. Mara waited to hear if it was anything new. It wasn't. "I'm going to hang up now," Mara said. "I won't be taking further calls from this number." She hung up. She sat for a moment. The house was quiet around her in the way it was quiet in the mornings, a working quiet full of small sounds. Someone in the kitchen, a door somewhere, the particular February light coming through the window onto the desk she'd claimed as hers in the room that had become, without anyone officially declaring it, her room. She opened her laptop. She had a payroll to run. Decker appeared in the doorway about an hour later. He did that, appeared without announcement, checked that she was there and working, sometimes said something and sometimes didn't. Today he said, "Was that her? Yes. Done?" Mara thought about Loretta's voice, the calculations failing in real time, the attempt to reframe the ledger. "Done," she said. He came and stood behind her and looked at the screen for a moment. His hand, the one she'd taped, now properly healed, rested on the back of her chair, not on her shoulder, but close. "You know what you're worth," he said. "You've always known," Isa suspected, Mara said. "There's a difference." She felt him almost smile. She'd gotten good at sensing that, the almost smile, the weight shifting barely a degree. "You're right," he said. "There is." She kept her eyes on the screen. The numbers were clean. The books were balanced. Everything in its correct column, every obligation accounted for, every debt resolved. She had come here as a line item, a liability passed between two people who'd decided her value without asking her. She was still here, and the ledger, for the first time in her life, was entirely hers.